Hi, I'm glad you're here. It's me, a real person on this side of the mic, not a synthetic voice. I want this to feel like a real conversation, even if I'm the only one talking. And if you hear me having a human moment or shift in my chair, it's just because I'm actually here with you. Thanks for being here, because I want to tell you a bedtime story about making things that are delicious. Maybe it's a dish you already like and are familiar with, or maybe you want to hear about something you don't already know much about. Either way, even though I'm here to keep you company, I'm not going to be offended if you drift off and stop listening. I'll just quietly finish. So don't resist fading away, okay? Before I start, please know I'm going to read your comments and I'm interested to know where you're listening from. Let me know who you are and leave any comments to tell me what you like about the food we talk about. Also, please subscribe so you can come back to hear more. There's so many stories I want to tell you. Okay, so do me a favor. Let those shoulders drop, close your eyes, and I'll start your story. Tonight, we begin with something humble. A bowl, a pot, a few ingredients gathered with quiet intention. But what we're really making is a story. A story that stretches across centuries of kitchens, market streets, fishing boats, and family tables. A story carried in steam rising from a bowl of Miso Ramen. So take a deep breath. Let the day slow down. The kitchen becomes our small world now. To understand Miso Ramen, let's start long before ramen existed at all, in a world where fermentation was still a quiet discovery, and where people first learned that time could transform food into something deeper, richer, and more nourishing. Miso itself begins in ancient China, more than 2,000 years ago, where early fermented soybean pastes were created as a way to preserve food and concentrate flavor. These early pastes, ancestors of what would later become miso, traveled to Japan alongside the spread of Buddhism in the 6th century, carried not only as food, but as knowledge. In Japan, miso found a new home. It was embraced slowly, then completely. Over centuries, it became something deeply woven into daily life. By the time of the Kamakura period, a simple meal might consist of rice, dried fish, vegetables, and miso. It was no longer just an ingredient. It was nourishment, it was preservation, it was culture. Families made their own miso, fermenting soybeans in wooden barrels, letting months or years shape its flavor. Each region developed its own style, influenced by climate, water, and local taste. And so, miso became something alive, something that carried time within it, something that, when stirred into soup, turned simple ingredients into warmth. Centuries later, another story begins. Noodles in Japan. Carried from China in the late 19th century, they appear first in port cities, served to workers in small shops and street stalls. Over time, these wheat noodles meet Japanese flavors, dashi, soy sauce, seaweed, and something new begins to form. Ramen is born. There's a certain kind of comfort that lives in a bowl of miso ramen, the kind that feels older than the kitchen it's made in, older than the hands preparing it, older even than the recipe itself. It's the comfort of something that's traveled far, changed slowly, and carried with it the memory of many lives, many places, many quiet meals shared across time. Tonight, the kitchen becomes a small glowing world. The light is soft, The air is still, and somewhere in the background, something gentle simmers. This is where our story begins, not just with ingredients, but with time itself. Because miso ramen is not a dish that begins when you turn on the stove. It begins centuries ago, in a world where people first discovered that time could transform food into something deeper, something more meaningful. Long before ramen existed, before noodles were dropped into broth, before pork was roasted and sliced, there was miso. Miso began as something humble, a preservation technique, a quiet solution to a simple human need: how to make food last longer, and how to make it more nourishing in the process. Its earliest ancestors appeared in ancient China over 2,000 years ago, where fermented soybean pastes were used to deepen flavor and extend shelf life. When these techniques traveled to Japan around the 6th century, they were embraced, refined, and slowly transformed into something uniquely Japanese. Over generations, miso became more than food. It became a daily ritual, a foundation, a presence in nearly every home. Families would prepare their own miso, fermenting soybeans with salt and koji, then storing the mixture in wooden barrels. Months would pass, sometimes years. And in that quiet darkness, something remarkable would happen. The miso would change. It would deepen. It would become richer, more complex, carrying within it the invisible work of time and microorganisms. Each batch would be slightly different, shaped by climate, by environment, by the hands that made it. Miso became alive in this way, not in a literal sense, but in the way it carried memory, place, and identity. And for centuries, it was used simply in soups served alongside rice. Warm, comforting, familiar. No one yet imagined it would one day become the heart of ramen. Meanwhile, another story was unfolding. Noodles were traveling. From ancient China, where strands of dough were stretched and pulled into long ribbons, noodles began their slow migration across cultures. They appeared in different forms: thick, thin, hand-pulled, knife-cut, but always with the same essence: grain transformed into something soft, warm, and sustaining. By the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants brought noodle soups to Japan's port cities. These early dishes were simple: wheat noodles served in broth, often with small toppings. They were practical meals, affordable and filling. At first, they were not yet ramen. But over time, Japanese cooks began to adapt them. They added local ingredients. They refined the broths. They shaped the dish into something new. And slowly, ramen was born. Then came a turning point. After the Second World War, wheat flour became widely available, and ramen stalls began appearing across cities. These small, mobile carts served steaming bowls of noodles to workers, students, and anyone in need of a warm meal. At this stage, ramen broths were typically light, soy sauce or salt-based. Miso was still waiting in the background, still tied to its traditional role. Until, in the cold northern city of Sapporo, something changed. Sapporo is a place shaped by winter. Long, heavy snowfalls, cold air that lingers, a climate that calls for warmth not just in passing, but in something that lasts. In the 1950s, a ramen chef began experimenting. He looked into miso, not as a side, not as something separate, but as a foundation. He wondered what would happen if this deeply fermented paste became the base of ramen broth itself. The idea was unconventional. Miso had always been part of simple soups. It was not typically used to build something as layered and complex as ramen. But experimentation is often where tradition grows. And so, slowly, Carefully, miso was stirred into broth. The broth became richer, deeper, warmer. It held onto heat longer. It filled the mouth in a way lighter broths did not. And most importantly, it comforted. This was the birth of Miso Ramen. From that moment on, Miso Ramen began to spread. Across Japan, chefs adopted and adapted the idea. In Sapporo, it remained hearty, often enriched with butter and corn, reflecting the region's agricultural landscape. The noodles grew thicker, slightly wavy, designed to hold on to the rich broth. Elsewhere, variations emerged, some lighter, some darker, some blending different types of miso to create balance. But always, the essence remained. Miso ramen was warmth. It was something you turned to when you needed comfort. For our miso ramen, we'll be using pork shoulder. Farmers have long valued the shoulder because it contains layers of fat and muscle that become tender when cooked slowly. It's not a fancy cut, but it's a wise one. In kitchens from the American South to rural China, pork shoulder has been roasted, braised, smoked, and stewed into dishes that bring people together. In tonight's ramen, this pork will become something inspired by char siu, the famous Cantonese style of roasted pork. Char siu translates roughly to fork roasted. In ancient Chinese cooking, long forks were used to hold strips of marinated pork over open fires. The meat would slowly caramelize, glistening with sweet sauce. Street vendors in southern China perfected the technique centuries ago, hanging long strips of red glazed pork in the windows of bustling food stalls. Travelers passing by could smell it long before they saw it. That smell, sweet, smoky, savory, has pulled hungry people through doorways for generations. Tonight, that same spirit finds its way into our ramen. Back in the kitchen, the story becomes tangible again. A pork shoulder rests, tucked in the refrigerator for at least 2 hours, coated in a marinade of soy sauce, mirin, sake, garlic, and spices. It's been sitting quietly, absorbing flavor, allowing time to do its work. The scent is warm and complex. Soy sauce brings depth and umami, that mysterious savory richness that Japanese cooks have celebrated for hundreds of years. Mirin adds sweetness, a delicate syrup note that glows like amber. Sake carries a faint fragrance of rice and fermentation, a reminder that cooking in Japan often begins with ingredients that have been patiently transformed by time. Chinese 5-spice powder whispers something ancient into the marinade. Star anise, cloves, cinnamon, Szechuan pepper, fennel, 5 spices representing the 5 elements of traditional Chinese philosophy: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. The pork is placed into a container and tucked into the refrigerator. And then the waiting begins. 2 hours, or perhaps overnight, or even 2 days. And while the pork rests, something wonderful happens. The marinade seeps into the meat. The salt begins to reshape proteins. The spices bloom. This quiet transformation is one of the most beautiful secrets of cooking. Food changes, even while we sleep. While the pork marinates, let's wander a little through history. Though ramen feels deeply Japanese today, its roots begin in China. In the late 1800s, Chinese immigrants arrived in Japanese port cities like Yokohama and Kobe. They brought with them bowls of noodle soup called ramen. The word ramen likely comes from the Chinese phrase ramen, meaning pulled noodles. These early noodle soups were meals for laborers with a hearty broth and satisfying handmade noodles. Maybe a slice of pork. Japanese diners quickly fell in love. But Japan, as it often does with borrowed ideas, transformed it. Japan has always had a gift of adaptation. By the early 20th century, ramen had begun evolving into something uniquely Japanese. Different regions developed their own styles. In Hokkaido, Miso Ramen rose to fame during the cold northern winters. The fermented soybean paste created a rich, warming broth, perfect for snowy nights. In Fukuoka, tonkatsu broth simmered pork bones for hours until the soup turned creamy and white. Tokyo developed soy-based ramen that balanced clarity and depth. Each bowl reflected its place, its climate, its people. And today, ramen is everywhere, from humble street stalls to Michelin star restaurants. But its heart remains the same. After some waiting, the pork emerges from the refrigerator now, carrying the aroma of its marinade. We preheat the oven until the kitchen warms with anticipation. The pork goes in at a high temperature first, beginning the transformation. The heat caramelizes the sugars, darkening the surface, building layers of flavor. Soon, the oven temperature lowers, and the pork roasts slowly for hours. Slow cooking is a quiet art. In traditional kitchens across Asia, slow simmering and roasting have always been the secret to depth. Time draws out flavor the way patience draws out stories. The house begins to smell extraordinary. Garlic, sweet soy, warm spices. The scent drifts through rooms like a promise. Some cooks say this moment, when the aroma fills the home, is the true beginning of the meal. It drifts through the kitchen, soft and steady, like a signal that something good is on its way. Because cooking isn't only taste, it's atmosphere. It lingers in the air. But while the pork continues its long journey in the oven, something new begins on the stove. The soul of the bowl, the broth. Every great ramen begins with broth. If ramen is a story, the broth is its voice. Across nearly every culture on earth, there is some version of broth. In France, cooks simmer bones into delicate consommé. In Vietnam, fragrant pho broth steeps with spices and charred ginger. In Korea, rich bone broths simmer through the night. In Jewish kitchens, golden chicken soup is often called penicillin. Humans have always understood something simple and powerful. When ingredients simmer slowly in water, they give themselves completely. Bone releases collagen. Vegetables surrender sweetness. Fish offers depth. Spices bloom into warmth. And the liquid that remains becomes nourishment. Broth is food in its most comforting form, warm, restorative, alive with flavor. Tonight, our ramen broth carries whispers of sea and land. Chicken, sesame, garlic, bonito, and the deep golden richness of miso. A pot rests on the stove now. 4 cups of chicken broth are poured in. Already, something comforting begins to happen. Even before seasoning, the smell of warm broth has a remarkable ability to soften the edges of a long day. Chicken broth has been made for thousands of years. Ancient Chinese medical texts from the Han Dynasty describe soups made from poultry and herbs to restore strength. Medieval European cookbooks contain instructions for similar broths. Across cultures, chicken broth became known as something restorative and gentle and healing. Perhaps that's why a bowl of ramen feels so satisfying. Because at its heart, it is simply broth, elevated with centuries of culinary wisdom. The pot warms slowly over medium-low heat. The broth begins to whisper small bubbles along the edges. Nothing rushed or forced, just warmth, building gradually. Next, we reach for a skillet. A spoonful of sesame oil glides into the pan. Immediately, its aroma rises into the air, deep and nutty, almost toasty. Sesame oil is one of the oldest cooking oils known to humanity. Sesame seeds were cultivated over 5,000 years ago in regions stretching from India through the Middle East. Ancient Babylonian texts mention sesame oil. Indian Ayurvedic traditions prized sesame for both cooking and medicine. From there, sesame traveled across trade routes, eventually becoming essential in Chinese, Korean, and Japanese cooking. A single drop of sesame oil can transform a dish. It's powerful, aromatic, a little mysterious. When it warms in the pan, the kitchen fills with its scent, a scent that has traveled across continents and centuries. Next, 2 cloves of garlic are diced. Garlic may be the most beloved ingredient in the world. Nearly every cuisine uses it. Ancient Egyptians fed garlic to workers building the pyramids. Greek athletes consumed garlic before competitions, believing it gave strength. Roman soldiers carried it on long marches. In China, garlic has flavored food for thousands of years. In Japan, garlic became especially popular in ramen broths during the post-war ramen boom of the 20th century. When the garlic hits the hot sesame oil, it begins to sizzle gently. The sound is soft and inviting. The scent becomes deeper, sweeter, and more complex. Cooking garlic is one of the great sensory pleasures of the kitchen. Even people in the next room will notice. Even neighbors might wonder what's being prepared tonight. Now a shallot joins the pan. Shallots are cousins to onions but carry a softer personality. Their flavor is gentle, sweet, almost buttery when cooked. The name shallot traces back to the ancient city of Ashkelon in the Middle East. Traders brought them across Europe and Asia centuries ago. Over time, they became a favorite among chefs because of their subtlety. Unlike the bold bite of raw onion, shallots melt quietly into sauces and broths. They deepen flavor without overwhelming it. As the shallot cooks with the garlic, the two begin to soften. The scent becomes mellow. A small cloud of fragrance drifts upward. This mixture, garlic, shallot, sesame oil, is a quiet foundation, the kind of base flavor that great cooks build upon. Now, we reach for something special. Bonito flakes. These delicate curls of dried fish look almost like thin rose petals, light, feathery, fragile, but their flavor is anything but delicate. Bonito flakes are made from skipjack tuna that has undergone one of the most fascinating preparation processes in culinary history. The fish is filleted, simmered, smoked repeatedly, then fermented and dried until it becomes almost as hard as wood. This finished product is called katsuobushi. In Japan, whole blocks of katsuobushi were once shaved by hand using special wooden tools. Thin flakes would fall like fragrant snow. These flakes are a cornerstone of Japanese cooking, used to make dashi, the foundational stock of many Japanese dishes. Dashi is subtle, clear, and deeply savory. It forms the backbone of miso soup, noodle broths, simmered dishes, and sauces. Japanese cooking often emphasizes clarity and balance, and dashi embodies that philosophy perfectly. When bonito flakes meet hot liquid, something magical happens. They flutter and dance. Thin curls float and sway in the heat, and slowly they release their umami flavor. Deep, savory, oceanic. It's the taste of the sea carried gently into the bowl. Now we take the garlic and shallot mixture and slide it from the skillet into the pot of warming chicken broth. The sound is soft, a quiet splash. Now the broth carries layers, chicken richness, sesame aroma, garlic warmth, shallot sweetness. Soon the bonito flakes will join, then miso, then sake and mirin. Each addition is a small chapter in the broth story. But the beauty of ramen broth is that none of these ingredients shout over one another. Instead, they blend and support and balance. To understand why miso ramen became so beloved, we travel briefly to the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. Hokkaido winters are long. Snow falls heavily. Cold winds sweep across wide landscapes. In the city of Sapporo during the 1950s, ramen chefs began experimenting with something new. They added miso paste to their noodle soup. The result was extraordinary. Soon, Sapporo became famous for miso ramen. People traveled there just to taste it. Even today, ramen alleys in Sapporo are filled with small shops serving steaming bowls to locals and travelers. Each shop guards its broth recipe carefully. Some simmer pork bones for hours. Some add ginger or garlic. Some top their bowls with butter and sweet corn, ingredients that thrive in Hokkaido's cold climate. But the heart of Sapporo ramen remains miso. Exactly the kind of broth we're creating tonight. And now, let's talk about miso. Few ingredients carry as much cultural depth as miso paste. Miso is fermented soybean paste, aged anywhere from months to years. The fermentation process, guided by a mold called koji, transforms simple soybeans into something deeply complex. Miso arrived in Japan over 1,000 years ago, influenced by Chinese fermentation traditions. Over time, Japanese regions developed their own styles. White miso, which is mild and sweet. Red miso, which is bold and earthy. Mixed miso, balanced and rich. For centuries, miso soup has been a daily ritual in Japanese households. Many families once made their own miso at home, fermenting large crocks of soybeans in cool storerooms. Each batch carried the flavor of its household. You could taste the difference between one family's miso and another's. Adding miso to our ramen broth is like adding a piece of living history. Now, we add the miso paste to our simmering pot. The paste is thick, almost clay-like, but when stirred into the hot broth, it dissolves slowly. Clear broth becomes golden and slightly opaque. The aroma changes immediately. Miso carries a scent that is both savory and slightly sweet. There's something earthy about it, something ancient. Fermented foods often have this quality. They remind us that time and microbes have worked together to create flavor. For centuries, fermentation has preserved food through winter months and long journeys, such as soy sauce, kimchi, cheese, bread, and wine. Miso stands proudly among these foods as one of humanity's great fermentation achievements. When the miso meets the broth, the paste dissolves slowly into the simmering soup, turning it aromatic and golden. The broth rests now. The pot sits quietly on the stove, filled with warmth, carrying within it the gentle union of chicken, sesame, garlic, bonito, and miso. And the pork continues its slow roasting in the oven. The kitchen feels alive, fragrant, and patient. And while the broth gathers itself and the pork deepens in flavor, we turn our attention to something that may seem simple at first glance. But like so many humble foods, its story stretches across continents and thousands of years. Let me tell you about the noodles now. Long before ramen shops lined the streets of Tokyo, long before the word ramen existed, humans were already making noodles. In fact, noodles may be one of the oldest prepared foods in human history. Archaeologists once discovered something extraordinary in northwestern China. Outside, an overturned bowl buried beneath layers of ancient earth were delicate strands of noodles, preserved for nearly 4,000 years. These ancient noodles were made from millet, a grain cultivated in early Chinese agriculture. Imagine that moment long ago. A cook mixing grain and water, rolling the dough, stretching it into thin strands, dropping it into boiling liquid, serving it to family members gathered nearby. A simple meal, but one that would quietly travel across centuries and civilizations. Because once humans discovered noodles, they never let them go. As trade routes expanded and cultures met one another, noodles traveled too. Across Asia, countless variations appeared. Chinese ramen, hand-pulled noodles stretched into long ribbons. Japanese udon, thick and chewy. Japanese soba, made from nutty buckwheat flour. Vietnamese rice noodles, delicate and translucent. Thai pad thai noodles, stir-fried with tamarind and peanuts. Even far beyond Asia, similar foods appeared. In Italy, pasta developed its own extraordinary traditions. Long strands of spaghetti, flat ribbons of fettuccine, tiny shapes like orzo. Though debates continue about whether pasta traveled from China or developed independently, the truth is that humans everywhere seem to arrive at the same comforting idea. Grain, water, dough, shaped into strands, cooked in boiling liquid, served warm. It's simple, efficient, and endlessly adaptable, which is why noodles have survived thousands of years. They're not quite like other noodles. They have a distinctive bounce, a slight chew, a subtle yellow color. And the secret behind this uniqueness is something called kansui. Kansui is alkaline mineral water. Historically, it came from lakes in Inner Mongolia that contain natural alkaline salts. When these minerals were added to wheat dough, something fascinating happened. The noodles became firmer, springier, more resilient when cooked. The alkaline environment also changed the chemistry of the wheat proteins, creating that characteristic ramen texture. Even today, most ramen noodles are made with alkaline salts to recreate this effect. It's a small detail, but it makes all the difference. When you bite into ramen noodles, you feel it immediately. That gentle resistance, the satisfying chew, that texture that holds broth beautifully. It's part of what makes ramen so beloved. In Japan, noodle making is considered a craft. In many ramen shops, the noodles are made fresh every day. Flour is mixed with water and alkaline salts. The dough is kneaded carefully, rolled thin, then cut into long strands. Some noodle masters spend years perfecting their technique. The thickness of the noodle, the exact hydration of the dough, the angle of the cut. Even the weather can affect the final result. Humidity changes how dough behaves. Temperature affects fermentation and elasticity. So, noodle makers adjust constantly, watching, feeling, listening. Because in great cooking, ingredients aren't forced. They're guided. Now, we bring water to a boil. A large pot filled generously, water bubbling with energy. Cooking noodles seems simple, but even this step carries small rituals in ramen kitchens. Fresh noodles often cook in less than 2 minutes. Dried noodles might take 3 to 5. But timing matters. Too long, and the noodles lose their bounce. Too short, and they remain firm in the center. Ramen chefs often cook noodles individually for each bowl. They lower the noodles into boiling baskets, lift them out with practiced speed, shake off excess water, and drop them into waiting bowls of broth, all in a matter of seconds. It's choreography, a quiet dance repeated hundreds of times a day. And when that ramen is served to you, slurping is encouraged. In many Western dining cultures, slurping noodles loudly might seem impolite. But in Japan, the opposite is true. There are several reasons for this. First, slurping cools the noodles slightly as they enter your mouth, allowing you to eat them comfortably while they are still hot. Second, the act of slurping pulls broth and noodles together, enhancing flavor. And third, slurping signals appreciation. A loud, enthusiastic slurp tells the chef you're enjoying a meal. In busy ramen shops, the sound of slurping fills the room. It becomes part of the atmosphere, part of the experience. A joyful soundtrack of satisfied diners. Why does ramen inspire such devotion? Why do people stand in long lines outside ramen shops in Tokyo? Why do late-night diners crave it after long days? The answer lies in balance. Ramen is a symphony of contrasts: rich broth, springy noodles, tender meat, fresh toppings, warm soup meeting cool air, savory notes balanced by sweetness. Each spoonful offers something slightly different, and perhaps more importantly, ramen is intimate. A bowl is held close, steam touches the face. Ramen is not formal dining, it's personal. We'll return to the kitchen and see that the pork has finished roasting now. It rests quietly on the cutting board. Resting meat allows juices to redistribute, a small but meaningful step. The first slice reveals a tender interior surrounded by caramelized edges. This chashu-style pork brings a gentle sweetness that balances the salty depth of the broth. Across Asia, pork has always been a beloved partner to noodles. In ramen shops, chashu, slices of pork, are often braised until meltingly tender. Tonight's roasted pork carries its own personality. Now comes the moment that ramen lovers know well: the assembly. Bowls wait on the counter, warm and inviting. The noodles settle into the bottom first, forming a soft nest. Then the broth pours over them, filling the bowl with golden warmth. Steam rises. The aroma is rich, slightly sweet, deeply savory. Slices of pork rest gently on top. Green onions scatter across the surface like small bursts of color. Finally, sheets of nori lean against the bowl's edge. Nori, dried seaweed, carries the taste of the ocean. Seaweed has been part of Japanese cuisine for over a millennium, harvested from coastal waters and dried into delicate sheets. Its crisp texture softens when it meets broth. And suddenly, the bowl is complete. There's a quiet story often told about ramen. In post-World War II Japan, food was scarce. The country struggled to rebuild both its infrastructure and its daily life. During this time, large quantities of wheat flour began arriving in Japan through international food aid programs. Wheat, which had previously been less common in Japanese cooking than rice, suddenly became widely available. Enterprising cooks and street vendors began experimenting with ways to turn this wheat into affordable, filling meals. And one of the most successful ideas was simple: noodles, served hot, in broth, with whatever toppings were available. Ramen stalls began appearing everywhere across Japanese cities. These mobile food carts could be pushed through neighborhoods and set up along sidewalks late at night. Under simple lanterns, vendors served bowls of ramen to workers, students, and travelers. The bowls were inexpensive. The portions were generous. For many people during those years, ramen was more than food. It was sustenance and hope and the simple reassurance of a hot meal. For many people, ramen represented survival. Over time, that humble street food evolved into a national obsession. Today, there are ramen museums, ramen festivals, and chefs who dedicate their entire lives to perfecting broth. But at its heart, ramen remains simple, a bowl shared between hunger and comfort. Somewhere beyond the kitchen, this same moment of assembly is happening again. In Tokyo, where ramen is defined into the art of balance. In Los Angeles, where it's reimagined with bold flavors and creativity. In Vancouver, where it reflects freshness, clarity, and the quiet influence of the sea. In New York, where it becomes intense and expressive. In London, where it's thoughtful and precise. Each place adds something. Each bowl becomes a variation, a reinterpretation, a new chapter in the story. And yet, when you lift the noodles, when you take the first bite, all of that complexity disappears into something simple again. Because no matter how far miso ramen travels, no matter how it evolves, it always returns to a bowl, a quiet moment, and a sense of being nourished. The bowls grow shallower, the noodles slowly disappear, the final sip lingers. And then, gently, the moment comes to an end. The kitchen grows still again, but something remains. A story that continues quietly every time someone, somewhere, prepares another bowl. And maybe that's the most beautiful part of it all, that something so simple can carry so much. The table is quiet now. The bowl rests in front of us. Steam curls upward, carrying the scent of miso, sesame, roasted pork, and ocean air from the nori. We lift the chopsticks. The noodles glisten. The broth ripples gently. This is more than just dinner. It's centuries of cooking wisdom distilled into one bowl. Fermentation, slow roasting, careful balance, cultural exchange, and above all, nourishment. Take a sip. The broth is warm and soothing. Take a bite. The noodles bounce softly. The pork melts. The flavors settle like a blanket on a cool evening. And for a moment, the world slows down. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories are told not with words, but with a bowl of ramen